For those of you that don't know me, I'm Owen. I'm one of the co-founders of Previous Next, and I'm sure you would have seen a few of our other people talking here over the last couple of days. Like many of you, we're very much stuck inside the Drupal bubble, and it's very rare for us to kind of look outside that to other CMS platforms and get a sense of actually what's happening in the market. So I think today's talk is an opportunity as much for me as it is for you to have a look outside that bubble and do a few things. The first thing I wanted to do was really test the stories that we tell ourselves about Drupal. We all tell ourselves things that make ourselves feel nice, but some of those things may not be based in much reality. And then from there, have a look at kind of where Drupal does sit within the competitive CMS market and who are our real competitors out there, and then what Drupal's path ahead is looking like. So I think one of the things that struck me in preparing this talk was this kind of sense of foreboding that we might have actually reached peak Drupal. And by peak Drupal, I mean we might have actually seen the largest number of sites that are running Drupal at this point in time. But I hear you say Drupal powers over 1 million websites. Yes, that's the case at the moment, but we might see that over time that may not be the case in the future. So just looking at some statistics before we get into some lies, we can see from the Drupal.org usage stats of Drupal core that for the past couple of years, in the red circle there, we've been sitting in this kind of stasis of when Drupal 7 got released and Drupal 8, which is the orange line at the very bottom there, was starting to gain some traction. So the good thing is that we're in that green circle now. In the past 6 months, we've started seeing a steady uptick of Drupal 8 usage and a corresponding downtick in the number of Drupal 7 sites. The thing that's worth pointing out is that this top green line is the total usage of Drupal sites, and we can see a gradual downtick in that as well. So that may be some cause for concern, or maybe not. So a lot of you would be familiar with this hype cycle for new technologies diagram. And I think us as a company, Previous Next, we invested a lot of passion and enthusiasm into Drupal 8's release. And we had this big peak of inflated expectations that come day one when it's released, everything's going to be solved and we'll be riding free from there on. The reality, as I'm sure was the case for many of you, that we dived into this trough of disillusionment for quite a substantial period. So I've talked to quite a lot of other Drupal firms, and we did go through this tough year last year, primarily because clients are inherently nervous about new technologies. And we had this period where Drupal 8 really hadn't proved itself with any major case studies. We didn't have a whitehouse.gov moving to it that we could say, look, there's the proof that it's going to be fantastic. And clients, because they're making choices that are going to last them 5-10 years in terms of technology, weren't going with Drupal 7. Why would you go with a decade-old technology for your new platform? And so I think we did see quite a lot of clients move to other CMS platforms through that period, to other competitive platforms, or just not do anything, just kind of tread water. The good thing is, I think we're on this slope of enlightenment now. We are seeing that uptick in Drupal 8 adoption, and I would be quite confident to say that we'll hit that plateau of productivity at some point in the near future. Now, this hype cycle is not to be confused with the 7 stages of grief, which you might be familiar with. I think we did go through quite a bit of shock, denial and anger with the release of Drupal 8 and having to wait that period, but I think we're in the acceptance period now of finally finding a way forward. So if we extrapolate those trend lines that I had in the first graph, we can just draw a straight line out in terms of where things are heading. And I think we can reasonably confidently say that all those old Drupal 6 sites should die a slow death over the past couple of years. And the thing that's interesting here from a kind of linear perspective is we're still looking at a few years before Drupal 8 might surpass Drupal 7 usage, because for a lot of clients, there's no point moving to Drupal 8 unless they're doing something significant and substantial. So the other thing that's, again, worth pointing out, as I mentioned, that top blue line of total usage of Drupal is trending downwards over time, And I drew a graph right out to where that hit 0, and it was somewhere like 2035. But as we all know with technology, things don't move in a linear fashion. And of course, we've got that great example of Apple releases the iPhone, Nokia, which is riding high as the world's biggest mobile phone manufacturer, doesn't really pay too much attention. Apple releases the iPhone 4, that gets a big uptick, and by the time the 4S is released, Nokia is literally an extinct company. So I think the thing to bear in mind is that we can't really foresee those big game-changing technologies entering the market and causing this type of disruption in the CMS market. But I hear say Drupal powers 30% of the top 10,000 websites, and I've heard that bandied about by people in the past. That is a blatant lie. But if you do look at the real stats, the story is not too bad. So of the top 10,000 most visited websites, we're nudging 5.5–6% of total sites running Drupal in that sector. And probably more relevant to us in this part of the world, the top 100,000 is sitting around about 4%. And this comes from builtwith.com that analyses technologies that companies are using. So if you look down the bottom here, we can see, not very well in the colour here, but there's been an uptick in the top 10,000 in terms of sites that are moving to Drupal. More concerning is the downtick across these lower end of the kind of lower numbers down the scale there. And there's a large factor to bear in mind that's driving that. And that factor is something called WordPress. So this graph is from W3 Techs. The green line at the top is sites that are moving off being static to a CMS. And the red line in the middle here is sites that are moving to WordPress. And you can see that they basically mirror each other in terms of shape. So it's very fair to say that if a site is moving to a CMS, it's more likely to be moving to WordPress than any other product. And we've got little Drupal down here that between 2011 and now has maybe moved a couple of 0 percentage points. Nothing of any significance. So what does this mean in terms of the overall use of CMSs across the board? So this graph, again from BuiltWith, is sites that are actually using a CMS, and WordPress is now sitting at about 30% of total sites running a CMS are WordPress sites. Massive market share. The bizarre thing here is that WebEx Panel, which spins up sites when people are doing conference calls, is the next biggest CMS. But the good thing for us is that Drupal is sitting around 7% of all CMSs being used. And the opportunity is that there's another 37% here of the rats and mice CMSs that at some point these guys are going to move off to one of the dominant platforms, and Drupal's quite well positioned to pick up a fair number of those. The other thing worth mentioning down here is that the only proprietary platform that's showing up in these visible stats is Adobe Experience Engine, or CQ5, whatever they're calling it this week. So what we can be confident from these statistics is that I think we are going to see Drupal's total market share decline, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We're currently sitting at about 3 to 7% of the total market share, depending on which way you slice that and how you want to interpret that. But the good news is Drupal 8 adoption is growing steadily, and we're especially seeing that at the higher end of the scale, and ultimately they're the clients that we really care about. So how does that relate to the overall CMS market? And this is a bit of a snapshot of who we're competing with at this point in time. Boom, WordPress. So I think Dave in his last talk mentioned WordPress as a mosquito. They're not a mosquito, they're a behemoth. They account for an inordinate number of websites out there in the market, and they are gaining traction within the larger, more complex site space. I know that News Corp recently did a kind of head-to-head of WordPress versus Drupal and went with WordPress for whatever reasons, but obviously ones that they felt confident enough with. So it is a threat, and I think the factors that are driving WordPress's success are quite numerous. The first one is, as Jay demonstrated, it's provided free with many hosting accounts, And if you click on install WordPress, you're going to have something that's quite usable quite quickly. If you're installing Drupal as a novice user, you're going to get to a blue screen and go, what the hell am I supposed to do from here? So that end of the market really isn't going to be adopting Drupal. And so it is very easy for WordPress novices and smaller agencies to offer services around that that we can't compete with very easily. There's a very strong plugin ecosystem. Their word for modules. We've got plugins now too. It's all very confusing. And they've got a very strong e-commerce offering with WooCommerce, if you're familiar with that. The company behind WordPress Automatic recently bought WooCommerce, so there's even tighter integration there. And from a maintenance and upgrade path, WordPress is pretty painless. So if you're running a small site, you click the upgrade button and it automatically downloads things, and bang, you've got a new improved website. And I know there has been quite a lot of talk about adopting that model within Drupal that's met with disdain by our DevOps people who are sitting over here somewhere. I love having a green laser, by the way. And more importantly, I think overall, is that WordPress has an excellent SaaS platform at WordPress.com. If anyone asks me to spin up a small website for them as a favour, I just go straight to WordPress.com and go bang, and there's a totally usable site for them there. So what does this mean for the other open source CMSs excluding Drupal? We'd all be familiar with these platforms. Their market share, at the highest end, I think Joomla has about 1% total market share of the CMS market, and things like Typo3, Plona and Braca are sitting around 0.1%. So my perception of those communities, without having any direct involvement in them, is that their days are probably numbered. There'll be some diehards that kind of cling to those platforms, but in terms of overall market impact, they're at great risk of being dead in the water in a relatively short amount of time. There's also the commercial open source market. So you'd be familiar with these very successful New Zealand originated companies, Squiz and Silverstripe, who've built a CMS themselves, as we used to do, build your own custom CMS. They've open sourced the core, and then they can provide a range of professional services and hosting and things like that around the platform. And they're significant companies, much bigger than any other local Drupal companies. I think Squiz is sitting around 300 staff, Silverstripe's around 75 from what I can tell. So great, successful companies. And they still have substantial market share, I know particularly in New Zealand, with Silverstripe being mandated for government websites. So moving into where most websites are being built these days, it's on SaaS platforms. So the statistics are unfathomable, I think is the easiest word. So WordPress.com has 16 billion page views a month. They have 50,000 sites being spun up a day. Most of them are probably porn, but that's neither here nor there. Even Squarespace, that kind of feels like a bit of a new entrant to the market. They've got 1 million customers. They've got $200 billion in funding. And I think more importantly for the Drupal market, we've seen a lot of our non-profit customers that were previously using Drupal moving to SaaS platforms like Nation Builder that give them all of their campaigning tools, fundraising tools, social network and engagement tools, out of the box, no maintenance required for, I don't know, $100 a month. So we just can't compete with that as Drupal. And from a non-profit organisation's perspective, why would they invest in having to pay expensive Drupal developers when they can spin something like that up? So moving to the headless CMS market, this has been talked about quite a bit in other talks, so I won't dwell on it. The interesting point is that of those top 10,000 websites I talked about, more than 13% are now running React or Angular in some form. And so there is a big push into that space of having decoupled front ends. And even a legacy platform, proprietary platform like Kentigo that some of you would be aware with, they're out there in the market as a competitor to things like Sitecore. Their big push now is headless CMS on a SaaS-based platform with Kentigo Cloud. So there's a lot of movement there that we should pay a lot of attention to. And at the same time, there's still people out there building their own custom CMSs in frameworks. Again, my anecdotal evidence would be is that those people are moving to pre-built CMSs, and that these frameworks are used for highly customised experiences, often in combination with headless front ends. So let's get to the big end of town. And there's a dominant player in this enterprise CMS market. And you might have heard of it. His name's Drupal. And as I talked about, they've got 7% share of total CMS usage and about 6% at the top end of the market. That's double Adobe Experience Manager, and it's 5 times Sitecore, which I was quite surprised about. We always consider them to be head-to-head competitors, but we've maintained a dominant lead there. In the other part of the enterprise CMS market, there's quite a lot of competitors there, and they adopt different models. Episerver has recently bought Ectron that you'd be familiar with. Hippo is quite a new Java-based open source CMS. There's a company behind that that has a similar model to Acquia, supporting it and providing hosting. And then you've got the big legacy companies. So we'd all be familiar with migrating clients off TeamSite, which is owned by OpenText. You might remember a platform called Vignette that every major enterprise seemed to run in the past. They got bought by OpenText. Little OpenText is a $2.6 billion company with 14,000 employees, and they're not going away anytime soon. In a similar way to IBM and Oracle, we'll have these long-term relationships with enterprise clients, and their clients say, oh, we need a website, and IBM says, well, we've got WebSphere, even though it's 20 years old and probably way more cumbersome than something like a Drupal. So there's these legacy relationships there that prevent enterprises moving to something like Drupal. And if we look at something like the Gartner Magic Quadrant, for those of you that aren't familiar, if you're a CIO or a CTO, you'll pay your $20,000, $30,000 subscription fee to get your analyst reports from Gartner, and they'll go out and do research and make recommendations around who are considered leaders in the enterprise CMS space and who are the followers and who you should be considering in your decision choice around what to move to. So I think interestingly, Acquia have put a lot of attention into getting on this list over the past few years, and that's a significant investment on their part to work with the analysts, educate them, go on road shows, and to their credit, they've made it up into this leader quadrant. Now that's good for Drupal from the context that we can say Acquia is considered a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant, but it's much better for Acquia. So it's not necessarily something that a CTO would go, oh, well, I'm going to move to Drupal, but just do it myself. The whole model that Acquia have adopted is that you're buying the Acquia platform, you're not necessarily just buying Drupal. So where does this leave us? So Dries, in his last Dries note, he's kind of waxed on this theme for a number of years now, that Drupal is for ambitious digital experiences. And I think by the types of talks that we've heard in the last couple of days, the level of complexity that people are talking about and the amazing projects that people are producing is testament to that. We are building complex platforms that require a high degree of expertise and aren't the types of things that you can just click the install button and launch in a short amount of time. So just recapping, based on what we talked about before, what does that mean in terms of what Drupal 8 in particular is not ideal for anymore? Small sites, why would you even bother, honestly? Unless you're building out a whole platform of similar sites based on a distribution like GovCMS, you've got much better options and much cheaper options. And us as a company, we wanted to deliver value to our clients, and we'd be recommending that they use something like that. Interestingly, there was a Drupal business survey done a few months ago, and they found that more than half of companies that considered themselves Drupal firms are now also offering other CMS platforms like WordPress. And so if you are targeting that space, then there's nothing wrong with kind of diversifying and offering WordPress sites to your clients if it's appropriate. You're not being disloyal to Drupal by doing so, in my view. You're offering good value to your clients. I talked about Nation Builder as an option for non-profits. And then there's the whole consideration of e-commerce. Now, full props, respect to the commerce guys for pushing the commerce bandwagon, but in reality, when I think Commerce Guys has 3 people, 4 people building modules for Drupal, and Shopify is now a multi-billion-dollar listed company on NASDAQ. There really is no comparison in terms of the feature set that you're going to get. And us as a company have no problem talking to our clients and saying, you want e-commerce, we'll build you a Shopify site or a Magento site or whatever, and we'll make it look like a Drupal site, and you'll just link across to it. And our client, Amazing, a telco in Australia, recently did just that. At the higher end of the scale, you've still got big enterprise e-commerce platforms from people like SAP in that market. And then custom web apps, we've talked a lot about, or we've heard a lot of talk about that this week. That's debatable, in my opinion. I'm not a technologist myself. And I think there's a lot of value in considering Drupal for custom frameworks, but if you're building something super bespoke that doesn't really have much content, or you're not managing lots of users, well, why not just use a framework like Laravel or Symfony or something else? So I think where we sit as a company is very much in the comfort zone. Maybe I should get back on the couch for this one. And the Drupal comfort zone is clients that are naturally going to move to Drupal. So obviously the government space is huge for us in Australia. We obviously put a lot of effort ourselves as a company to educate clients about the benefits of Drupal for their market, and that's now translated into it not being mandated, but being the basis of GovCMS. And we've seen huge uptake across the board. It really is the go-to CMS in Australia for government sites. Media and publishing is still a big market for us, so TV channels, radio stations, custom publishing platforms, like this one's a targeted personalised content platform for doctors that we built a couple of years ago. Still very relevant for Drupal. And higher education, so universities have moved en masse to Drupal in Australia, as I'm sure a few have in New Zealand. And then the final sector that we work with quite heavily is what we'd call challenger enterprises, that are large organisations that are trying to kind of chomp at the heels of the entrenched leaders in those sectors. So Amazing, that I mentioned before, have more than 1 million customers, and they're growing very, very rapidly, and they're using Drupal 8 as a means to respond to that in terms of their web presence and other touch points. So the types of technical attributes that these clients share are quite numerous. Most of them tend to be quite large-scale clients. They have very complex content requirements in a lot of cases. They have a big mix of public users and need for quite complex community features in some cases, whether that's integrating with existing social networks or providing that functionality within their own platforms, as was the case with Medical Observer. Having the ability to scale for high visitor traffic is a given for most of them. Many of them are managing multi-sites in various ways, so our approach tends to be building distributions that we can deploy into containerized environments to solve that issue. And then lots of custom features and third-party application integrations. So I don't think there's any project that we've done recently that hasn't had a significant aspect of that. And then from an operational perspective, these clients share a lot of attributes as well. So most of them have quite well-established internal web and IT teams, have either been using Drupal for a number of years already, or have worked with another CMS, and they're relatively sophisticated across the main. There's always exceptions to those rules, but we're dealing with people that understand things like content modelling and content types and things like that. Many of them have ambitions to be self-reliant to varying degrees, so we've recently worked with a local council that said, okay, now you've built it, we'll take it over from here, and that's fine, that's their prerogative. We're delivering them good value by allowing them to do that. And in many cases, we're dealing with very large-scale IT teams that manage their own cloud hosting infrastructure. So they're coming to us and saying, we have our AWS accounts and environments that we're wanting to deploy into. We need your assistance to build the platform on top of that we can deploy our Drupal sites into. And Transport for New South Wales, I showed, was a great example of that, where they've got significant amounts of infrastructure, but we've gone in to consult with them around how they can set that up to host Drupal. And these types of clients are looking for cost savings. A big bank really doesn't care about paying their $300,000, $500,000 Adobe Experience Manager license, but a publicly funded organisation does, because they need to justify that to their stakeholders, who are ultimately us. And one of the final things is many of these organisations finally are using agile delivery methods. It's been quite a big push by us with our clients in the government sector in particular to move away from this, we're building a bridge and we need a specification to define that before we get started. We're now almost working in a purely agile way with a lot of our clients, where we have dedicated teams blended in with their teams and working in iterative releases with them. And then the final operational thing that many of them have is speed to market. They want to be able to innovate, get things out to market, respond to changes as they occur. And again, Amasim's a great example of that. They're pushing hard to win customers off people like Vodafone and Telstra, and their technology allows them to do that. So where Drupal is also competitive, and we've heard a lot about this from other people over the last couple of days, is this notion of digital experience management. And I won't dwell too much on it, but basically we're talking about the large global enterprises that are looking for a platform that can solve their interactions with all of their customer touch points. So getting back to Adobe Experience Manager, I won't read their blurb, but it's all about delivering touch points and compelling content and Internet of Things and lots of other buzzwords. But how they talk about their offering to their clients is that it's a marketing cloud with a number of components to it, of which Adobe Experience Manager is just one element, and then that's complemented by related technologies for things like sending emails and doing analytics and those types of things. Sitecore, what have they got? They've got their experience platform, does similar things. And then there's another company called Acquia that does very similar things. So obviously all these companies are targeting similar types of clients and trying to solve similar types of solutions for them through a very similar approach. So if you look at Acquia's offering now, it's around the kind of vertical products that they're able to provide to a client that allow them to guide their customers through specific journeys, personalised content, provide hosting, all of those types of things. You'll notice there's only one mention of Drupal in this slide when Acquia is actually talking about their products. So that's quite a different approach to us as an independent vendor, where we're heavily pushing Drupal, whereas Acquia are pushing their notion of this platform. And feeding into that is their big push over the past couple of years to sign up large global partnership arrangements with companies that we really wouldn't think of as being Drupal firms. And the reason for that is that these agencies own the relationships. And if you own the relationships, you influence the technology decisions. And if you get a toehold in there for Drupal, then that relationship may last 5, 10 years and result in many millions of dollars of revenue. And it's worth understanding how this whole enterprise purchasing approach works. So first and foremost is that technology decisions are made at the C-level within these organisations. The big difference being with organisations that adopt Drupal is that much of the initial push to use Drupal is driven by the grassroots within, say, government or non-profits. So you've got developers who are saying, oh, we've seen this Drupal thing and we should use it and try it out, and then that gets escalated up. In an enterprise, most of those decisions are being made by the C-level off the basis of their Gartner reports and things like that. The biggest factor in all of this, though, is long-term relationships. So if you're a Razorfish or an IBM or a Deloitte Digital or someone like that, you've got these long-term relationships with suppliers. You might be doing 50 or 100 different projects for them at any one time. And it's very easy for you to just walk in and say, okay, well, for this next project, we're going to be using Adobe Experience Manager or maybe Drupal. And because of those relationships, the C-level will pay close attention and often not even bat an eyelid around what technology's been recommended to them. So the big factor for us in all of this is that these global decisions on platform, they're not being made here. So if you'd seen the Vodafone case study yesterday, that decision was made in London and then it was rolled out across the world. And you'll see that across the board. We've recently worked with a big global car company, and their decision was made in head office that they were going to move away from Experience Manager to Drupal, and that was then the initiative to be rolled out across the regions, and we ended up talking to one of the regions who said, how the hell do we do this? So I think that's quite important for us just to be aware of, is that we really don't have much influence here. And these platforms will be in place for a decade or more. But, and this is a big but, Drupal is gaining enterprise legitimacy, as we've seen for other people's case studies. And what that's doing is that the large clients are pushing their large vendors to provide Drupal services, hence the relationships that Acqui has established with global digital marketing agencies. And that's an opportunity. So where does this leave us? And the us in this equation is the smaller independent Drupal firms, which I'm sure a lot of you are represented in this room. By the way, we're stuck at the bottom of the world as well. So I think the inclination in all of this is that we could just run off the tracks as the freight train of the enterprise monster comes hurtling towards us. And believe me, I've been rolled over by one of these big evil corporations and it's not pretty. But by the same token, we can look at it as a good opportunity. So what we see as Previous Next as being the opportunity is that the more sophisticated a client is, the more likely they're going to be using best-of-breed technologies around their requirements. So a client's very likely to be using something like Salesforce and Microsoft Dynamics for their CRM. They're likely to be using Marketo as their automation personalization engine. Like I said, they've probably got their own AWS accounts set up. They're using things like Elasticsearch, Google Analytics, machine learning, might be running TensorFlow, and they're highly sophisticated around the use of that. And Drupal presents the opportunity to bind all of that together as the unifying interface. And we're finding more and more that we're building projects in this way. And the benefit to the client is that they can swap out these external services as they see fit, whilst retaining a cohesive admin and front-end experience. I'm not even going to get into headless or anything like that. That's been covered in great detail in other talks. But this is where we see Drupal fitting in a very competitive and compelling way. So what can we expect from Drupal 8 ourselves? So as I said, the overall market share is going to dip, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that Drupal's moved up the value chain and we're dealing with bigger and bigger clients as a result of that. I think Drupal 8 will maintain or grow its market share within that comfort zone, and us as organisations can keep servicing those clients very, very well. They often do look to the independent providers to service them in that capacity. And there is that growing market share within larger enterprise. How much of that trickles back down to the smaller players is yet to be seen. But what we can do right now as individuals in this room is to put our focus onto Drupal 8 wholeheartedly. If you're still building Drupal 7 sites for clients, please don't. I think the world's moved on and every Drupal 7 site just kind of keeps us stuck in old paradigms. Like I said, keeping on servicing those comfort zone clients, there's nothing wrong with that. They're fantastic clients, they have good budgets, they have long-term relationships that they establish with organisations like us, and we can run very viable, solid businesses off the back of them. And I think the big opportunity is that we can start diversifying into technologies that do complement Drupal 8 at its core. So someone mentioned to me yesterday that they were finding it quite hard as a contractor to find work within Drupal 8. And I don't know whether I actually said this at the time, but in retrospect I said, well, there's actually lots of opportunities to become expert in certain aspects around Drupal 8. So whether that's becoming a content modelling expert, whether it's becoming a Salesforce integration expert, and we can do that as agencies as well to have a point of difference. And of course we do have the opportunity to partner with larger agencies that are delivering these enterprise services. I think the risk that we have is that we're essentially just being treated as implementers at that point, and unless there's a formal long-term partnership being entered into, those agencies will be looking to supplement you with offshore services as quickly as they can to keep their costs down. So my personal view is that there's opportunity, but it's not necessarily the main ball game for us as an independent firm. And then finally, to leave things on a high note, I was a little bit worried about this being something that wasn't too optimistic as the final talk of the day. But the come to Jesus moment is contribute. And through contribution, you'll find that you'll get a lot of things in return. So I think if you haven't really adopted Drupal 8 in a major way yet, contribution is a great way for your team to get experience in Drupal 8, to get the relationships with other core contributors and module contributors, and basically feel like they're part of something. And we found that incredibly effective for our team and incredibly fulfilling. Your company also gains profile within the Drupal community. I've had a couple of people say to us in the last couple of days that they can't understand how Previous Next has been able to do what they've done as a little 20-person company from Australia and being up in the top 5 Drupal contributors. And the answer is just do it. It's as simple as that. And you can adopt a 20% contribution policy for your developers to do that, that ultimately pays back big dividends. And the dividend is that you can then attract engaged developers yourself and grow your expertise. And the clients themselves can benefit from an open source strategy that you're able to provide them and help them contribute in turn. So the message that I want to leave you with here is that Drupal is not at risk. There are big opportunities for us as vendors, as developers, and as a community. And all we have to do to achieve that is to contribute and drive the project forward. So I'll leave it at that. I'd like to thank everyone for coming today and thank the organisers for a great event. It's been a great couple of days.